Hello everyone, my name is Gary O'Mealy, and in this video we are going to start our unit on the nervous system by discussing some nervous system terminology. So the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system together make up the entire nervous system. So what we're basically dealing with here is the nervous system being the other way of sending long distance messages in the body. Obviously, we just wrapped up our unit on the endocrine system, and we learned that the other way of sending long distance messages throughout the body is to secrete hormones and then allow the bloodstream to circulate that hormone until it finds its target cells. Okay, so in this unit, we are going to look at pretty much all aspects of the nervous system, but for the sake of this lecture and this video, we're going to keep things as simple as possible for right now. So the first thing we want to do is contextualize the nervous system within the framework of the negative feedback loop and the homeostasis loop that we talked about before. So the central nervous system is going to consist of the brain and the spinal cord, which are more than often than not going to act as our control centers in those sorts of neural homeostasis loops and reflexes that we've looked at before. And then the peripheral nervous system is mostly going to consist of spinal and cranial nerves that carry the information over long distances, whether it is an afferent signal, which is the signal sent from the sensor to the control center. So this would be, say, from the hand to the brain or from the heart to the brain, and then efferent signals, which would be going the other way. So this would be from the central nervous system to the effector, so from the brain to a muscle or something like that. Okay, so back in chapter 4, we looked a little bit at the composition and function of nervous tissue, and we noted at the time that there are two major types of cells found within nervous tissue, neurons and glia. Neurons are very distinctive structurally in that they have a long axon connected to a large cell body that has lots of dendrites on it. The axon functions to carry electrical impulses directly to the target for that neuron, and we'll look at that in more detail in a future lecture. And this signaling is greatly sped up by the presence of the myelin sheath, which is illustrated here in this kind of purple color. And the myelin sheath is deposited by types of glial cells called oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells. And you'll learn fairly soon that oligodendrocytes are only in the central nervous system and Schwann cells are only in the peripheral nervous system. We're going to have a separate lecture dedicated to the glial cells, so we'll talk about other types of glia like astrocytes and ependymal cells and microglia, but we're just going to kind of focus on some basic stuff for now. So we'll talk about those things in the future. Let's talk about white and gray matter. If you don't know exactly what white and gray matter are, you've probably at least heard of it before. So the white and gray matter actually has everything to do with that myelin that we just talked about. It turns out that the myelin that is deposited by the oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system gives off a very characteristic white color. You don't even need a microscope to be able to see this white color. So you can see in this cross-section of a brain here, not really a cross-section, it's like part of the brain's been kind of sliced out so that you can see the underlying tissue. You can clearly see the distinction in color between the white matter here and then the gray matter here on the outside. So the reason why the white matter appears white is because there is a large collection and a high density of oligodendrocytes there. So again, the myelin that's laid down by those oligodendrocytes gives off that white color. So if we see the white color, that indicates, well, there must be a lot of myelinated axons there. So the regions that do not contain these axons and do not contain any oligodendrocytes are not going to appear white, and by default they will appear kind of that grayish, light brown in color instead. So that's why we call it gray matter. So gray matter is going to consist of pretty much anything but myelinated axons. So that's usually going to mostly be the cell bodies of neurons and then also some unmyelinated axons. The unmyelinated axons you're more going to see in the spinal cord gray matter rather than the brain gray matter. So an important thing to understand here is that you will not see this distinction between white and gray matter anywhere but the central nervous system, and that is because The Schwann cells that lay down myelin in the peripheral nervous system do not appear white, so white matter is something that is absolutely exclusive to the brain and to the spinal cord. So if we look at how the white and gray matter are organized in the brain and in the spinal cord, in the brain we can see that for the most part, the gray matter is concentrated in the outer cerebral cortex, which you can see right here, kind of in this fleshy pinkish color here, and then also in specialized internal regions called basal nuclei. Now these are kind of colored here in orange and red and blue here, but those are absolutely regions of gray matter. And what we can take from that, based on what we learned in the previous slide, is that those regions of gray matter are very highly concentrated in the cell bodies of neurons. So basically you can think of a whole bunch of neuron cell bodies kind of all clustered together in those regions. If we examine the organization of gray and white matter in the spinal cord, you will hopefully notice that it is very different. Rather than the gray matter being on the outside and the white matter being on the inside like it is in the brain, it's flip-flopped here. So the white matter tends to be on the outer regions of the spinal cord, and the gray matter tends to be in that inner butterfly or H-shaped region in the middle. So the internal gray matter is going to contain the cell bodies of motor neurons that are going to project their axons out through the spinal nerves to hit their targets, and then also some interneurons, which we will more fully define at a later time. And then the white matter that you can see here actually consists of myelinated axons that are either carrying information up the spinal cord, up to the brain, or carrying outgoing motor information down from the brain, down the spinal cord to hit a particular target, whether it be your foot, the heart, or something else. Okay, so now we're going to start introducing some specific nervous system terminology. There are two types of structures within the nervous system I want you to be aware of. The first, we've kind of mentioned before, is a local congregation of neuron cell bodies. So think of a whole bunch of neuron cell bodies that are all kind of jam-packed in together. They're all kind of stuck in the same place together. Well, it turns out that we have two different words for this depending on whether we're talking about the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. If a local congregation of neuron cell bodies occurs in the central nervous system, we call that a nucleus. A good example of this is a basal nucleus, which we saw just a couple of slides ago. If this occurs outside the central nervous system, we instead are going to call it a ganglion. The second type of structure is just a big bundle of neuron axons. You can kind of think of it as bundling all these axons together like it's making a big wire. So in the central nervous system, this is called a tract. So we actually saw a whole bunch of tracts of axons in that cross-section of the spinal cord. We have tracts of axons that carry information up to the brain and tracts that carry it down to the brain. And we're going to learn in a later lecture, those are respectively called ascending tracts and descending tracts. In the peripheral nervous system, a big bundle of axons is called a nerve. Now, this is actually kind of tricky because growing up and learning how to speak the English language, the word nerve is something that you probably learned fairly early on. So you've probably been using this word nerve a lot throughout your lifetime to say things like, oh, this person's getting on my nerves, or oh, I pinched a nerve. But just be aware the word nerve is not always going to be the scientifically appropriate word to be using all the time. You're only going to use the word nerve if you're talking about the peripheral nervous system. So a couple of things to kind of make sure we clarify here. Number one, it's kind of unfortunate that we're using the word nucleus to describe something brand new, because up until now, we already knew the word nucleus could mean two different things. We've seen in our review of chemistry that an atom has a nucleus where it keeps its protons and its neutrons. We've seen in our review of cell biology that a cell has a nucleus where it stores its DNA, and that's where transcription and a couple of other important processes occur. Now, the nucleus that we have just introduced is a much, 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 much larger structure consisting of many, many, many different cells all congregated together, like these basal nuclei that are highlighted here in this red color in this section of someone's brain that it looks like we did a CT scan on. So, again, it's kind of unfortunate that we're using the word nucleus for three different things, but I trust you all to keep those three different things separated from each other, even though we're using the same word to describe all three. Okay, and then another issue here, keeping track of whether to use the term tract or nerve, which is something I mentioned before can be kind of tricky. So look at this diagram here. This is showing you the flow of neural information from the time light hits your eyeballs. The back of your eyeball is called the retina, and that's where the light-sensitive photoreceptor cells are located. When light strikes your retina and activates those photoreceptor cells, we will produce action potentials, these electrical impulses, that will travel through the optic nerve and then eventually make their way to the back of your brain, which is a region called the occipital lobe, which is where your visual cortex is located, and that's where that visual information is going to be processed and corrected and eventually turned into an image that we perceive. Now, what I'll have you notice about this, there's a couple of things to notice about this, but there's one thing I want you to pay attention to right now. So when the light first, when this information first starts traveling from the back of the eye, it is traveling through the optic nerve, of which we have two optic nerves. We have one on the left and one on the right. But then once this optic nerve starts getting deeper and deeper and deeper into the brain, look at what we call it at this point. Now we're calling it the optic tract. So what this tells us is that these big bundles of axons here were not actually a part of the brain just yet at this point, which is why we called it the optic nerve. But once it penetrates into the brain tissue and starts getting deeper in, then we start calling it the optic tract. So again, this is a case of making sure that you're using the right term, the right terminology that is appropriate for the right situation. Because if you are using the right terminology, and if you trust that others are using the right terminology, then there's actually quite a lot of information that you can glean out of a situation just by paying attention to what types of terms are being used. Okay, so we're starting to wrap up this lecture, so let's talk about some nervous system functions, most of which you've probably already been able to figure out on your own. First, the nervous system functions in sensation and perception of the external and internal environment. So sensory neurons, we'll learn about sensory neurons in the next lecture, are activated by things like temperature, light, pressure, and when they sense these things, they transmit electrical information, we call these afferent signals, to the brain or to the spinal cord. So as far as sensation goes, these sensory neurons are acting as both sensors and the means by which we send input signals to the control center. The nervous system also functions in integration. You can also think of this as information processing. So the cells and nuclei within the brain or spinal cord receive that incoming sensory information that we just talked about, process it, strategize, and then we prepare for organizing the appropriate response. So if you put your hand on a hot stove, that's the sensation part of it. You sense that the stovetop is hot, it hurts. You send that information through the sensory neurons in your hand. Their axons go all the way through your arm, into your spinal cord, up to your brain. The cells of your brain, specifically the cerebral cortex, are going to receive that sensory information, process and integrate that information, and then figure out, okay, what is the most appropriate response for this person having their hand on a hot stove? And that's going to lead us to the third aspect. The nervous system also functions in getting a response to occur. So effector cells are not actually a part of the nervous system. So your muscles, your heart, your glands, they are not part of the nervous system, but the nervous system plays a crucial part in getting information relayed to those effectors so that we can get our response to occur the right way. So effector cells and tissues respond in such a way that it is appropriate for the stimulus. As far as the nervous system goes, motor neurons in the brain or in the spinal cord will send outgoing efferent signals from the control center location, whether that's the cerebral cortex, a basal nucleus, the spinal cord, directly to that effector by using a neural nerve-based pathway. Okay, so before we wrap up this lecture, I want to spend some time pointing out some things about the flow of neural information in the nervous system, because it's really going to be important for you to get a handle on this so that things will seem more natural going forward and you can think about new information as it's presented to you instead of worrying a whole bunch about stuff like this. Okay, so for the sake of this exercise, we're going to look at this diagram here, and what you're meant to see here is that the example we're being provided is that someone is sticking their hand underneath shower water. So everybody, I assume, takes a shower the same way. You turn the nozzle, you turn the hot water nozzle, and you're never sure whether the water is too hot or not hot enough. So before you step your whole body into the shower and expose your whole body to the shower water, you stick your hand under there to test the temperature first, right? So for the sake of this example, let's say that the water is way too hot. So we're going to stick our hand underneath this hot water here, and what's going to happen here is that hot water is going to activate thermoreceptor proteins that are on the nerve endings or dendrites of this sensory neuron right here. So we're going to kind of follow this green pathway right here, which is an afferent pathway that is carried by a sensory neuron, okay? So we're going to follow this afferent pathway. So when we activate those thermoreceptors, that is going to stimulate and produce action potentials, which are carried through the axon of this sensory neuron. So we're going to follow it all the way through here. This axon of this sensory neuron is going to enter in through this root of a spinal nerve. So we're going into the spinal cord, and then we are going to send this information up to the brain. So you can see that this axon is going to climb up through the white matter of the spinal cord, climb up through one of those ascending tracks all the way up here. We hook up with another type of neuron here called an interneuron. So we're going to release neurotransmitter from this axon terminal here of this sensory neuron. That'll stimulate action potentials in this interneuron. This interneuron will then send action potentials to the next neuron, which is located in this basal nucleus called the thalamus, which we will define better here in just a second. And then this interneuron right here from the thalamus is going to relay that sensory information to the cerebral cortex right here. So that completes the afferent sensory portion of this pathway here. Now, of course, we know that if you're sticking your hand under really hot shower water, your natural reaction is going to be to jerk your hand back. So this really only describes the first half of getting your hand jerked back. All we've really described so far is the process of getting the information about the water being too hot from the skin in your hand to the cerebral cortex of your brain. We haven't yet done anything to activate the muscles in your hand and in your arm to pull your hand back. That's going to be what the efferent side of things is for, and that's why we're going to follow this red pathway now. So we're going to activate what's called an upper motor neuron here, so we're able to kind of get communication between these two ends here. We've received the information about the water being too hot, and now we're going to do something about it. So we're going to send action potentials through this upper motor neuron axon. We're going to, that axon's going to go down through the white matter of the brain. So this axon is going to be myelinated, so that is why it should make sense that it's going through the white matter. You'll notice that on the efferent side of things, it's not going to hook up with the thalamus like we saw for the afferent side, and that there's a reason for that we'll point out on the next slide. but we're going to send this outgoing information through the axon of this upper motor neuron, down through the descending tracts of the spinal cord, and then we're going to hook up with what's called a lower motor neuron, which has its cell body in the gray matter of the spinal cord here. And then that lower motor neuron will pass its axon through the spinal nerve and then out towards the muscles in your arm and in the muscles in your hands so that you can activate those muscles and use those muscles to pull your hand and pull your arm back from the source of the very, very, very hot water. Okay, so what we've just done there is we have described the flow of neural information, both afferent and efferent, for something as simple as sticking your hand underneath really hot shower water. So I pointed out a few things here, but let's go ahead and make sure I point them out again so that you can get the gist of what is the really important takeaways here. Number one, stimulation of sensory receptors generates a graded potential in the sensory neuron. If that stimulus is strong enough, an action potential will be transmitted in the direction of the CNS. Okay, so we're assuming that the shower water was very, very hot, so that means that the stimulus is very strong. So we kind of took it for granted that action potentials would be transmitted. Now, if the water was just kind of lukewarm, that stimulus probably wouldn't be very strong. So in that case, it's not a given that we would be sending information to the brain. Second, the afferent signal enters the central nervous system either through a spinal nerve, which is what we just saw, or through a cranial nerve if the stimulus occurs kind of already close to the brain, like it would for taste through the tongue, vision through the eyes, or hearing through the ears. If it is a spinal nerve, which it was in the previous example, an interneuron will carry the information up to the brain through an ascending tract. Third, the interneuron of the ascending tract will likely synapse on a neuron of the thalamus, which I pointed out to you before. The thalamus is a major sensory relay center in the brain. It basically acts like an old school operator, which if you don't know, or if you don't know the history, and if you don't, I totally get it. I understand. I mean, this was well before my time too, but in the old days, if you called someone on the telephone, you wouldn't usually call them directly. You would call an operator, and then the operator would have a big switchboard on the wall, and you would tell the operator who you want to talk to, and they would change how a bunch of wires are connected on the switchboard to hook you up with who you want to talk to. So the thalamus actually works very much like that. So when sensory information gets relayed through the thalamus figures out which particular part of the brain, which part of the cerebral cortex that sensory information needs to go to. So that is the function of the thalamus. It is a sensory relay center. It basically acts like an operator to determine which part of the brain needs to receive a particular type of information, incoming sensory information. So the axon of this interneuron of the thalamus will then be projected towards the appropriate control center in the cerebral cortex. So something that we'll learn in chapter 13 is that different parts of the cerebral cortex have different functions and different faculties. So you don't want to assume that every part of the cerebral cortex is exactly the same. Okay, and then we saw on the efferent side, an upper motor neuron will fire action potentials, and then that information is sent down through the spinal cord through descending tracts. And then at the appropriate depth of the spinal cord, which we'll learn more about in chapter 13, but for now, you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, so you want to make sure you're picking the right kind of exit point to get your information to where it's supposed to go. If your information's going to your hand and to your arm, you don't want to send the information all the way down to the very bottom of the spinal cord, because then you'd be basically going too far. It would be like if you're driving on the highway and you're supposed to take a particular exit. Well, if you drive 5 miles past your exit, you're going to have a hard time getting to where you're supposed to go. Okay, so once we get to the appropriate depth of the spinal cord, a lower motor neuron will pick up the signal, fire action potentials of its own, and carry that efferent information out through the spinal nerve. And the axon of this lower motor neuron will synapse on the effector cells, which in the case like what we saw before would be skeletal muscle, but there's no reason why it couldn't be something else as well. Okay, so this picture here, you can kind of see different aspects of the nervous system that we've talked about before. Obviously, the brain and the spinal cord make up the central nervous system. Nerves and ganglia make up the peripheral nervous system. Something that we're probably not going to get to talk about very much this semester is the existence of what's called the enteric nervous system, which is basically a collection of neural cells, neurons in your digestive tract that can act as independently functioning control centers that help to regulate your digestion, the contraction of smooth muscle, and the movement of food and digested materials through your gut. Okay, so the last thing that we'll talk about here are the divisions of the nervous system. So you have the somatic nervous system, which is responsible for voluntary and conscious perception and motor responses. We're going to cover that all in chapter 14. So some examples here would be your vision, your taste, your hearing, your sensory perception, and then also we include skeletal muscle contraction in that as well, at least the nervous system component to that. You also have the autonomic nervous system, which is going to be responsible for involuntary responses, usually for the sake of maintaining internal conditions and keeping homeostasis. This is usually going to involve activation of glands, smooth, or cardiac muscle. That'll be what we cover in chapter 15. Some examples that we have or have not seen before include vasoconstriction and vasodilation, dilation of the pupil and the contraction of the muscles in the iris to get that to happen, sweating, which we've talked about before, changing heart function in terms of heart rate and contractility. So those are all things under the control of the autonomic division. And then I mentioned the enteric division, which consists of ganglia and nerves that control the smooth muscle and glandular tissue of the digestive tract. Okay, that's going to wrap up this video. Here is a list of vocabulary terms you probably ought to be aware of. And then for checking your understanding, number one, in the case of visual perception, why does the name of the pathway change depending on the anatomical location? And number two, describe in detail the flow of neural information from the moment you touch a hot stove to the moment you pull your hand away. All right, that wraps up this video. If you have any questions at all, feel free to drop a comment in the comments section. If not, I will see you next time. So long.